Chapter 37, Land of the Tender, Body of Gold, Hard Pressed Against Desire. And I do have content warnings for this chapter. First, for graphic depictions of self-harm. And second, more of a warning, sex pollen. There's your warning. Why? The boy asked, taken aback. Shilian replayed the boy's strikes and moves in his head, and casually showed him a few example maneuvers. You've never used a saber, right? You use a sword, but the sword is tricky. Although it's fast and extremely aggressive, its range is fairly limited. If you've never used a saber before, try it next time. I think you might be even stronger with it. If Shilian saw someone with notable skill in martial arts, he couldn't help but want to approach them and chat. Not to criticize. He really was just interested in exchanging ideas. Because he possessed a wealth of experience in combat, he often didn't even need to think. Just one glance and he could pick up on the particulars of someone's style. Even if he couldn't explain the why, he would instinctively understand. Out of respect for his status, people would usually listen, but there were very few who'd actually pay attention. But this boy listened intently, seeming to mull over every one of his words and looking down at the sword in his hand from time to time. Shilian had rambled on for a while, when suddenly more rustling noises were heard within the woods. Like something had quickly crawled past. Shilian instantly remembered that they were still in danger, and that it really wasn't the time or place to get excited. He immediately grew serious again. Who knows if there's more evil on this mountain? This place needs a thorough cleansing. That boy gave a hard nod and presented his iron sword to Shilian with both hands. Shilian shook his head. Just defend yourself. You didn't leave earlier, and now there's no way for you to flee. I'll do my best to protect you, but you must also stay alert. Just then, the bushes rustled, and something leapt out. Shilian flicked his wrist to shoot a blast from his palm and hit it dead on. A terrible yelp, and that thing stopped moving. There was a strong stench of blood, which puzzled Shilian. A Binu hit by a blast would leak sticky, viscous body fluids, which didn't have such a strong, bloody smell. He approached to check. He parted the bushes, and sure enough, there was a large Binu on the ground, blown into several pieces from the blast. But that smell didn't come from the Binu itself. It came from something in its mouth. A scrap of skin off a human head, with chunks of long hair still attached. Binu were scavengers, and by the look of it, a human had been killed. The Binu had left small drops of blood along its trail in the bushes, and Shilian immediately followed the trail, the young soldier tagging along right behind. The farther they walked, the denser the blood splatter and the stronger the stench. Soon they heard feeble weeping. The little soldier brandished his sword and ran in front of Shilian to shield him, but Shilian pulled the boy back behind him. The trail wound past a field of blooming shrubs, and a sizable cave appeared before them. This cave had probably once served as a temporary shelter for passerby, but now corpses carpeted the ground. 20 or 30 Binu were clambering over the dead bodies, chomping on them to their heart's content. Several of them surrounded a young woman. Her belly had been ripped open and her innards were spilling out, but she was somehow still alive, and clearly in great pain. There was a bright red flower in her hair, as if she'd been interrupted in the middle of dressing herself. The fresh blood complementing that crimson blossom painted a particularly cruel picture. The Binu were licking at her hot, steaming organs, but just before they started to gnaw at her flesh in earnest, the sound of someone approaching made them turn to look. Shilian sent out a blast from his palm without blinking, slaying them all in a flash. He immediately moved out to check on the dead bodies. Among the corpses were men and women, old and young, all dressed in clothes made of humble cloth, their faces ashen. They were doubtlessly Yong'an civilians, and Shilian couldn't help but be shocked. He had thought the strange, white-clothed creature had called forth those nefarious beings. He had saved Lang Ying, so they had to be allies. But then why would the Binu feast on these Yong'an civilians? Inhuman creatures would never form a pact with humans unless they had a reason. So were these the terms Lang Ying agreed to? Were these the terms Lang Ying agreed to for the alliance? Were the lives of his followers his bargaining chips? The young woman was terrified and in agony. Blood sputtered from her lips, and she sobbed, "Don't kill me! I didn't do anything bad! Don't kill me!" Shilian couldn't help but remember the family of 3 who had died below the city wall. What sins had they committed? He bent down and soothed her in a gentle voice. "Don't be scared. Everything's okay. I'm here to save you." Yet that little soldier still had his sword pointed at the young woman. "Your Highness, be careful. She might be an evil spirit from the deep mountains. Of course, Shilian knew that was a possibility. But after much consideration, he still felt that he couldn't leave her like this. As long as he was prudent, it would probably be fine. He checked the young woman's pulse and inspected her palms and fingers for prints, instantly confirming that she was indeed human, and one who had never practiced martial arts, as her arms were weak and powerless. Taking a bottle of medicine from his sleeve, he immediately began treating her wounds. He twisted the cork out, and a faint, fragrant white smoke slowly filled the air. This medicine could temporarily slow down any poison, and was amazingly effective at treating wounds. Shilian wasn't stingy with that holy cure, using the entire bottle on her. "Do you feel better?" The young woman's wounds were a ghastly sight to behold, but after breathing in the smoke, some color returned to her face. She nodded weakly. "Are you from Yong'an? How did this happen?" Shilian asked. Tears rolled down her face. I am. I don't know how it happened. She paused and hissed in pain. "Everything was fine, but suddenly my dad died. My older brother died too." Shilian gently patted her shoulders. "Who killed them? Or rather, what killed them?" The young woman sobbed. "The killer was you!" At that last word, her face contorted with savage rage, and her eyes flashed and bulged. She opened her arms and pounced, seizing Shilian in an embrace. The young soldier had been standing beside Shilian on high alert the whole time, and he reacted with incredible quickness to this attack, immediately piercing her heart with his sword. She was already severely wounded, and with that strike, her death should have been swift. And yet she began laughing in uproarious delight, clinging to Shilian with a deadly grip and refusing to let go. And she remained like that until she finally stopped breathing. She clung on so tightly that the young soldier strained to peel her dead body off. "Your Highness, are you okay?" he asked anxiously. Shilian had thought that young woman was trying to ambush him as a last-ditch effort. Yet she had no weapons on her, and she didn't even bite or scratch. She only clung on to him tightly, as if that was enough, unrelenting even after death. Confounded, he replied, "I'm all right. He trailed off when, as if mocking him, he was assaulted by a sudden dizziness. The little soldier widened his one bright eye. "Your Highness?" It was like Shilian's insides were on fire. He couldn't speak, didn't want to speak, and didn't want to hear anyone else speak either. He shook his head and raised his hand, mute. Just then, the sound of women's giggling came from all around them. The two of them realized with a start that there wasn't a third person nearby. The giggling came from the bright red flower. Shilian instantly realized he'd fallen into a trap. Land of the Tender. This land of the tender wasn't the coy euphemisms for houses of pleasure where men found solace in feminine charms. These land of the tenders were flower yow that loved to flock together and survived by sucking away the essence of men. Their fragrance was dangerous, and Shilian immediately cautioned, "Cover your mouth and nose tight. Don't breathe in that flower's fragrance." The young soldier already had a layer of filter from the bandages wrapped around his face, so he didn't breathe in any of the scent. Hearing Shilian, he tightened his bandages. But then he realized Shilian had nothing to cover his own nose and mouth with, so he ripped a piece from the cleanest part of his sleeve, rubbed it hard, and patted it down until it was cleaner. Then passed it to him with both hands. "No need," Shilian said. "It's too late." He'd been on his guard while treating that young woman, but he didn't guard against smell. He'd been close to her, not knowing that the flower pinned in her hair was a land of the tender blossom. Before she died, she clung on firmly to Shilian, ensuring she wouldn't fail in her mission. This meant that Shilian had already inhaled many lungfuls of that tender fragrance, truly refreshing his spirit. Once the tender fragrance entered a man's body, he would enter a state of agitation. It began with weakness of the limbs, then progressed to mania. Shilian's whole body was already listless, like all of his tendons had been removed. But once the numbness passed, he'd be like a cask of explosives. If that strange, white-clothed creature appeared once more, Shilian really didn't know whether he'd be able to face off with it. He wasn't sure of its power in the first place. His initial reaction was to reach for his bottle of medicine, but then he realized that he'd emptied it to help the young woman, and in the end she still didn't survive. He glanced at the dead body next to him. The young woman wore a happy smile like she was sincerely glad she managed to snare the enemy in a trap before death, and she could finally pass in peace to join her family. Julien could only blame the gory scene that paled the flower's dangerous shade, and the stench of blood that masked the blossom's strange fragrance. He had never imagined that the face of a young girl, only in her teens, could bear such vicious resentment, or that she could commit such an extreme act. Around him, the flower Yao were exploding with excitement. He took the bait! Caught him! Is it really His Highness the Crown Prince? It's him! He's so handsome! My root can't hold back any longer! It's going to thrust out of the ground! The young soldier slashed with his sword, clearing out the flower shrubs surrounding them. Yet the stems were nimble, and that sword was worn. After one slash, it dulled. The flower Yao rocked back and forth, squealing, "My gosh, this little cuckoo! Your bush hasn't even grown in yet, but you're so ferocious! I'm on the verge of blooming, so how will you repay me?" The young soldier's eye flashed with rage. "You're dead! I'm gonna burn all of you to death!" The flower Yao curved their green leaves to touch their stems, like they were placing their hands on their hips. "My, so scary! We didn't provoke you, so why are you so mad?" "Don't burn them," Julien warned. "They're Yao, so if you set them on fire, they'll emit poisonous gas. You can't pull them out, either." That boy immediately dropped his hands that were ready to pluck, and Julien explained weakly, "They're poisonous thorns all over the stems." "My gosh, your highness is so sweet. Thank you for protecting us," the flower Yao flirtatiously cooed. "Just wait, we're going to bear fruit soon. We'll definitely take very good care of you." "Men who've cultivated abstinence from birth are so hard to come by. Even if your power will drop a level, if we deflower you, there's no other way. Sorry." As they giggled, the land of the tender's petals rubbed against each other. Their ambrosial, perverse intentions were more than obvious. That young soldier was bewildered, not quite understanding the meaning of abstinence, deflower, or level. But he could still tell that they didn't mean anything good, so he kept swinging his sword madly, cutting down the flowers and roaring in rage, trying desperately to silence them, that teasing laughter, not wanting Julien to hear. Julien, on the other hand, was cracking his knuckles. So that was it. Everything that transpired tonight was designed specifically to deal with him. In kidnapping Qirong, they had bet on his pride and duty as the martial god of Shinle, that he would choose to go after them alone, minimalizing their risk, and that seriously wounded young woman was bait to make him use up his medicine, leaving him powerless to save himself. The cooperation between humans and Yao was meant to lead him to this point. Julien's method of cultivation required a pure body. Those who worshipped the ascended cultivators who practiced this path were firmly convinced of the transcendence of gods untouched by earthly desires. If they couldn't protect their purity, their following would no doubt collapse and their powers would be devastated. It wouldn't be as serious as plunging from godhood back to mortality. And there was still the possibility of recovery after many more years of cultivation. But with things as they were now, there was no time for him to sit behind closed doors and cultivate for years. The statute of purity was strict at the Royal Holy Temple, and Julien excelled. He was number one in upholding those rules, as he had never broken or breached any of them. He thought himself as steady as a boulder of iron, and not even howling gales could ripple the still water in his heart. He'd undergone many trials and completed them perfectly each time. Yet even if his heart was like still water, he was nonetheless young and thin-skinned. Not to mention, there was a little soldier right behind him. Julien couldn't help feeling embarrassed as he was forced to listen to those flower Yao blatantly splash their depraved words onto him, as that lingering fragrance boiled his blood. His face colored with a humiliated blush, but no matter how much he abhorred his current predicament, he just couldn't stand up. He was still hanging on for the moment, but if those Land of the Tenders really bore fruit, it'd be big trouble. The best course of action would be, of course, to return to the imperial capital as soon as possible, and have Fengshen and Muqing shield him. But Julien's legs were limp and he could barely stand. Out of options, he called to the little soldier in a strained tone. "You, come over here." At the sound of his voice, the young soldier visibly flinched and froze. He hesitantly turned around but didn't dare go over. Yet the situation at hand didn't allow for any time wasted. Seeing his hesitation, temper flared in Julien's chest, but he forced it down. "Don't be scared, I won't do anything to you." Get over here, quick! At last, the boy moved. He rushed close to Shilian's side, but came to an abrupt stop 2 steps away. Shilian soundlessly drew in a small breath and extended a hand toward him. Help me up. Take me away. That young soldier very carefully took his hand and grasped it. He was like a man on the brink of death who had finally found someone to rely on. Shilian's whole body slackened in an instant, and he collapsed onto the boy. He was awash in the tender fragrance. His temperature boiled, and his body burned. Somehow, the boy's trembling hands were equally hot. Shilian leaned on him for a bit to regain some strength, then breathed in and pushed himself to stand upright. He didn't want to force someone smaller than him to support his person entirely, but with the boy's help he walked a few agonizing steps. The flower Yao called out to him when they saw him moving away. No, your highness, don't leave us! He is waiting for you on the road. If you leave here, you'll bump into him. He? Who's he? Shilian demanded. The land of the tenders were clearly terrified by just the mention of this mysterious being. After some hesitation, they mumbled a response. He is him. The flowers all nodded to each other. He is him, the one who brought us here.